13 months ago, my father was sitting in a family diner on Bardstown Road in Louisville, Kentucky, surrounded by 21 people he had known for what felt like his entire life. There were old neighbors from Ashford Lane, a few friends from church, some retired co-workers, and the kind of regulars who never needed to look at the menu because Friday night had already become a ritual. The room sounded exactly the way places like that always sound. Silverware against ceramic mugs, chairs scraping lightly across tile, low laughter from people who no longer needed to impress one another because they had been repeating the same conversations for years. And then, the way those dinners always do, the talk turned to children. Someone mentioned a grandson who had just started college. Someone else bragged about a son opening another branch of his business. Then one man turned to my father and asked about me, about Elena Whitmore, about his daughter working down in Georgia in emergency response. My father laughed. Not a warm laugh, not an amused one. It was the short, dry kind of laugh that comes from someone who thinks the answer is already obvious. He leaned back in his chair, lifted his coffee cup, and said, "I didn't do anything all that impressive." Said my title sounded bigger than it was. Said I was basically one of those people who shuffled paperwork, sat in meetings, and handled background logistics. Said I was never the kind of person who did anything truly significant. He said it casually, too casually. Casually enough that anyone listening could tell this was not the first time he had told that story about his daughter. 21 people heard him say it. 21 people heard my father reduce my life to a few cool, dismissive sentences, as if all the years I had spent building it were not worth a second look. What my father didn't know was that at that exact moment, the television mounted above the counter had just cut to a national breaking news segment from Savannah, Georgia. After 7 straight weeks of extreme weather, a major storm had come ashore and pushed the city to the edge. Flooded streets, widespread power outages, rescue vehicles moving through black water and wind. The camera swept past submerged intersections, flashing lights, and families huddled under porches, waiting to be evacuated. Then the shot settled on a woman in a reflective jacket, her hair pulled back, her face so focused it seemed to sharpen the entire frame around her. She was standing in waist-deep floodwater, one hand gripping a radio, the other signaling a rescue crew toward a house where people were still trapped inside. And the chyron at the bottom of the screen read, very clearly, Elena Whitmore, Senior Emergency Response Director. The whole diner went silent. Someone slowly lowered a coffee cup. Someone else turned all the way around to face the television. One man just stared at the screen, then shifted his eyes toward my father. My father kept his hand on the mug for a few extra seconds, like his brain had not yet caught up to the fact that the version of me he had just offered to the room had been publicly destroyed in less than 10 seconds. And if you have ever been misdefined by the people who were supposed to know you best, if you have ever heard someone speak about you with the certainty of ownership, while never having truly looked long enough to understand who you are, then you understand why that moment was more than embarrassment. It was the public collapse of a lie that had lived far too long. My name is Elena Whitmore. I'm 33 years old, and the moment that left my father speechless inside Turner's family diner did not come from luck. It wasn't handed to me by television. It wasn't some sudden viral miracle. It wasn't one of those stories where success drops into a person's life all at once and rewrites everything overnight. That moment had been built across 15 years of being minimized, sidelined, and quietly misjudged inside my own family. And it was built in dark mornings when I ran 4 miles before sunrise, because it was the only hour of the day that belonged entirely to me. It was built in the dozens of times I brought good news home and watched it land like nothing. It was built in years of work inside a system where performance matters more than personality, and where nobody cares what story you tell about yourself if you cannot carry the weight when things fall apart. And if you have ever had to become strong enough to survive not only the world, but also the absence of belief inside your own home, then this story is for you.
No, I really
Stay
like the
with
game.
me. Hit like if stories like this mean something to you, and subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one, because what happened after that night at the diner is where everything truly changed. To understand that night, you have to go back much further. Back to the brick house on Ashford Lane in Louisville, where I grew up in a family that looked, from the outside, perfectly fine. The front yard was always trimmed. The driveway was clean. Seasonal flowers appeared when they were supposed to. My mother changed tablecloths for holidays and always knew which neighbor had just had a baby, whose son had moved away, whose husband had fallen ill, and which casserole needed to be delivered to which front porch. My father, Douglas Whitmore, worked for more than 30 years in financial management at a local firm. He wasn't loud. He wasn't the kind of man who slammed fists on tables or threw his anger around the room. The difficult thing about my father was never volume. It was judgment. Cool, steady, repeated judgment. He measured people by what sounded respectable, what looked impressive from the outside, what was worth repeating to other men over coffee after church. And once he had assigned value to something, he rarely revisited the number. My mother, Marissa Whitmore, was warm in the way many Southern mothers are warm. Hot food, soft voice, open door. But her warmth followed the emotional map my father laid down. Whoever he valued, she softened toward. Whoever he placed slightly outside the center, she remained kind to, but never fully crossed over to protect. Not maliciously, just consistently. Just enough. My brother Ethan was 4 years older than I was, and from the time I was old enough to recognize the patterns in our house, when I understood one truth without anyone ever saying it aloud, Ethan was the natural center of gravity in the Whitmore family. Ethan was easy with people. Ethan knew how to walk into a room and make it feel as though the room had been waiting for him. Ethan played sports, had friends, had plans that sounded bright and outward-facing and easy to brag about. My father loved that. Loved how other people responded to him. Loved the particular look that came over his own face when someone mentioned Ethan with admiration. I was different, quieter, more inward. I read more than I talked. I liked to understand things before I spoke about them. In our house, that wasn't punished exactly, but it was never rewarded either. I want to be precise about this because it is the hardest kind of pain to explain to people who have not lived it. I did not grow up in a home where anyone screamed at me every day that I was worthless. No one called me a failure to my face. If it had been that blunt, maybe it would have been easier to name. What happened in my family was subtler than that, and in some ways, harder to defend yourself against. Ethan was lit from the front. I was left in the softer edge of the frame. My achievements were not openly denied. They were simply reduced, passed over, acknowledged with the emotional weight of a weather report. Meanwhile, almost anything Ethan did could become family material for a week. When I was 16, I finished at the top of my class, not in one subject, in almost all of them. I also helped tutor younger students through the science club. I ran 4 miles every morning before school because that was one of the only times of day I felt completely like myself. My English teacher, Helen Brooks, once stopped me after class and told me I had a way of seeing things other people walked past. I still remember the way she held one of my essays in both hands and looked at me with the kind of directness that makes you feel, for one rare second, entirely visible. She said, "Elena, you are not ordinary. You're just growing up around people who don't know where to look." I carried those words home in silence. I didn't repeat them at the dinner table. Children in houses like mine learn early that certain truths die the moment they are spoken in the wrong room. But I did bring home my report card. I said it in front of my father. He glanced at it, nodded once, said, that's good," and then turned to ask my mother whether Ethan had practiced that weekend. That kind of hurt doesn't explode and vanish. It settles. It stays. It teaches you how not to need too much, because needing too much guarantees disappointment. It teaches you how to fold yourself inward just enough to fit inside a home that never quite makes room. But I didn't collapse under that. I turned it into something else. Discipline, endurance, focus. If no one in that house was going to really look, then at least I could look straight back at myself in the mirror at 5 in the morning. Shoes laced, breath visible in the cold, the whole street still asleep, and know that the life inside me belonged to me.
I love to sing.
I ran 4 miles every morning, partly for fitness, partly because it was a promise I made without words. This body, this mind, this life, Yan would not be handed over to other people's misreadings. By my senior year, I knew I wanted to go into crisis management and disaster response. Not because it was glamorous, it isn't. Most of the time, it is invisible work, planning, coordination, systems, the kind of thing the public barely notices until everything begins falling apart. That was exactly why I was drawn to it. I like systems under pressure. I like the idea that when everybody else started spiraling, there were still people standing in the center of the break, cool enough to put pieces back into usable order. I did my research, programs, scholarships, career pathways, internships. I built my case carefully. I went to the kitchen table ready to answer every reasonable concern my parents might have. My father read the material for less than a minute. Then he set it down, shook his head, and said it wasn't a respectable path. Said it was one of those backroom fields where people worked hard and nobody remembered their names. Said with my grades I could do something that sounded like something. Law, business, finance. Things that held shape when spoken in a country club conversation. I asked him calmly if a profession devoted to keeping people alive when a city was unraveling was somehow not respectable. He didn't answer the question, because the question was never the point. The point was that in his mind, long before I ever sat at that table, I was not the child destined for significance. So every choice I made would always be translated downward into some smaller version of itself. 2 weeks later, my father announced at dinner that he was investing $58,000 to help Ethan launch his first building supply distribution company. He had already spoken to a lawyer, looked at warehouse space, run the numbers, planned the first year. He was giving Ethan something he had never given me. Public confidence. The kind that is not just money, but visible faith. The kind a father extends when he talks about his son's future, as though success is not even a question. I sat at the other end of the table, listening to his excitement, listening to my mother echo it, listening to Ethan laugh with the easy certainty of someone who had always been reflected back as important. And that same night, I submitted my own application. College wasn't magical. It didn't turn my life into a movie. I got partial aid and worked to cover the rest. Yet there were months when I counted gasoline in dollars and groceries in exact decisions. But college gave me something my family never had, an environment where competence was read in the correct language. If you did good work, people said so. If you came up short, they told you where. No one needed to love you to evaluate you honestly. After graduation, I entered Georgia's emergency response system. The early years were hard, long shifts, endless planning documents, night calls, interagency meetings, pressure that mostly stayed invisible unless something went wrong. But I fit there in a way I had never fit in the Whitmore household. I am not charismatic in the same way Ethan is charismatic. I don't charm a room open. I don't flood a space with ease. But I have something else. When systems start failing, my head gets clearer. When information becomes contradictory, when radios start overlapping, when several bad things happen at once, and most people's pulse climbs into their throat, something in me settles instead of panics. I don't become louder. I become more exact. The first person to really notice that was Calvin Reed. Calvin had spent years as a regional response chief. He wasn't impressed by enthusiasm. He respected steadiness. In our unit, one nod from Calvin meant more than 10 compliments from anyone else. The first time he stopped me after a full-scale exercise, he asked if I knew what made me different from some of the others. I said no.
So good.
He said, when they hear chaos, you hear sequence.
It's insane. I don't know why.
I have never forgotten that. Because it was the first time someone described the way my mind worked without making it sound like a deficiency. McAlvin started bringing me into higher-level regional command training. Not as favoritism, as recognition. He had enough years behind him to know who remained functional when things tipped beyond ordinary pressure. I was assigned bigger responsibilities, harder ones, the sort of work where decisions have actual consequence. Each step upward made me call home a little less with my news. Not because I stopped caring, but because I began to understand something expensive. If you keep carrying your victories to a door that never really opens, eventually even good news starts to exhaust you. I still called, but I stopped laying my heart down there.
It's crazy.
There were still moments when I tried. When I moved into a more senior coordination role, I texted my father. His reply was short. When I was selected for an interagency response planning group, and my mother asked whether I was getting enough sleep and then pivoted to telling me Ethan had landed a new contract. When I came home for holidays, I passed the hallway wall and saw framed photos of Ethan at ribbon cuttings, Ethan in front of warehouse signage, Ethan beside a short local business feature clipped from the paper. There was still a high school sports photo of him on the wall. His degree was there. His life existed in that hallway as a visible accumulation of family pride. I was not there. Not a single photo, not one certificate, not one marker, as though the Whitmore house had never learned how to preserve me in any version other than the other child.
I wanted to not.
That was when I stopped wondering what else I could do to be seen. Because the answer, painful and clear, was nothing. The problem wasn't that I lacked proof. The problem was that my father had assigned my value too early and had never once bothered to check whether he had been wrong. Then Savannah happened. 7 straight weeks of severe weather had left the ground saturated and the infrastructure brittle. When the storm finally came in, nearly every worst-case scenario hit at once. Power failures, flooded roads, trees down, communications compromised in key sectors, low-lying neighborhoods taking water faster than projections had predicted, emergency calls arriving all at once, without rhythm, without order, in the exact frantic pattern disasters create. I was assigned into a central operational command role for one of the hardest hit clusters. My job, if you say it simply, was to keep everything from failing simultaneously. But there was nothing simple about those first 30 hours. Now, the phone and radio never left my hand. Reports came in by the minute. A family trapped on a roofline with 2 children. A diabetic patient nearly out of insulin, a care facility losing backup power, a neighborhood near a creek taking on water too fast for ground teams to safely enter without rerouting. Every decision was real. Every delay had weight. Send one crew wrong and you lose time that may cost a life somewhere else. Hold resources too long and another sector buckles. I didn't sleep. There wasn't time for tiredness as an idea. There was only priority, movement, sequence, execution. Late on the second day, a distress signal from the southern edge of one flood zone cut off almost as soon as it came through. Minimal information, child present, elderly adult present, communications unstable. Or the nearest team reported access was narrow and the current stronger than expected. I went with them. In some places, the water was above our waists, brown, heavy, carrying debris and that sour storm smell of everything displaced from its proper place. We moved in a line through the street to keep our footing. The house sat back from the road, lower level already compromised, front door jammed under water pressure. We heard voices from an upper window space. A national news crew had been following one of the rescue routes earlier that afternoon and had remained far enough back not to obstruct, but close enough to film what happened next. Inside were a boy, maybe 8 years old, and his grandmother. The boy was shaking so hard his teeth clicked, but he wasn't crying. The grandmother looked exhausted, too weak to descend alone. Moments like that do not leave room for dramatic emotion. They require one thing: your voice must become steadier than theirs. I climbed first, crouched into the cramped upper space, looked directly at the boy and said, "Look at me. We're getting you out one at a time. You're okay. Just listen to me." He nodded. We lowered him first. Then I turned back and helped his grandmother inch downward, one movement at a time, her weight shifting onto my arm as wind shoved rain sideways through the broken opening. Outside, water hit the ladder. The camera kept rolling. I didn't know or care. At that moment, all that mattered was that an older woman was trusting nearly all of her balance to my grip, and my job was to get her down without letting fear move faster than judgment. We got them both out alive. That night, the footage aired nationally. When the news segment described one of the largest civilian relief operations the state had seen in years, it said our teams had helped move 54 people to safety in the first 24 hours alone. By the end of the 10-day operation, that number would rise to 489. But the thing viewers held onto was not the statistics. It was the image. A woman standing in floodwater, voice level, hands steady, directing people through danger without turning herself into the story. And in Louisville, Kentucky, while my father was still finishing a sentence about how his daughter was basically a paper pusher whose work sounded more important than it was, the entire room watched my name appear on screen. That is how my father's old story died. It didn't die because I argued better, and not because I finally delivered some speech sharp enough to corner him. It died because truth showed up on time, in the correct frame, in front of enough witnesses that no one could plausibly pretend they had not seen it. The Savannah operation ran 10 days. By the time the water started to recede, my legs hurt so badly that standing still made them throb from the knees down. My eyes burned from lack of sleep. Everyone on the team was filthy, drained, functioning on the strange bonded energy people develop after surviving pressure together. I returned to Atlanta, carrying what I always bring back from big deployments: damp gear, a body too tired to register itself correctly, and the deep silence that follows prolonged emergency mode. My apartment felt almost unnaturally still. I dropped my bag by the door and stood in the middle of the living room for a few seconds and made coffee. A small, ordinary act. The sort of act that lowers you gently back onto the ground after too many hours spent above it. My phone was full of missed calls and messages, colleagues, industry contacts, a few organizations, and 3 missed calls from my mother. Her last message said only, "Your father saw it too. Call when you're ready." I didn't call that night, not because I was furious, not because I needed him to suffer longer. The truth was simpler. I was too tired to walk into that conversation with a sleep-deprived mind and a nervous system still running on disaster tempo. When I spoke, I wanted to do it from clarity, not adrenaline. 3 days later, a Louisville number I didn't recognize called me. It was an old family acquaintance. He spoke carefully, or like someone who had spent some time deciding whether to make the call. He told me he had been at Turner's family diner that night. He thought I had a right to know exactly what had happened. Then he told me. Who asked first? How my father laughed. Exactly what he said. How the room froze when the broadcast came on. The way people slowly turned to look at him after they saw my name and title on screen. I sat at my kitchen table, one hand flat against the wood, listening to a man outside my family describe the moment my father's lifelong compressed version of me had fallen apart in public. The strangest part was that I did not feel triumphant. I had always assumed that if the truth ever stood up for me on its own, the first thing I'd feel would be victory. But that wasn't it. What I felt was closer to the release of weight I had carried so long, I no longer noticed its exact shape. When it finally lifted, I didn't laugh. I didn't cry. I just sat there, feeling something shift quietly inside me. Lighter, but not celebratory. Less burdened, but not healed. Somewhere beneath it all was the first outline of peace. My mother called again that same evening. Her voice had changed. No more soft redirections into food, weather, or harmless family updates. She asked whether I was all right and then actually waited for the real answer. When I told her the family friend had already explained what happened at the diner, she went silent for a long time. Then she said my father had barely said anything since that night. Said he had watched the broadcast again. Said it seemed as though, for the first time in many years, he no longer felt entirely safe inside the story he had always told about his daughter. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I said, let him sit with it for a while. 4 days later, my father called directly. I didn't answer the first call, or the second, or the third. His voicemails were short, uncertain, unlike the carefully measured man I had known all my life. On the third attempt, I picked up. There are some phone calls where you can tell from the first hello that something has shifted position. My father sounded older, not older in years, older in the way people sound when certainty has been removed from them. He said he thought we needed to talk. I said yes, I thought so too. He asked if I could come home to Louisville. I looked around my apartment, the rain jacket still hanging over a chair, worn the boots not fully dry, the team photo someone had sent me from the last day in Savannah. Then I said, 12 days. I didn't need those 12 days to punish anyone. I needed them so that when I walked back into that kitchen, I would not be the 16-year-old girl trying once again to explain why her report card deserved more than a nod. I wanted to arrive as a grown woman who understood exactly what had happened to her, exactly what she would say, and exactly what she would not trade away even for a late apology. The day I drove back to Louisville, November was gray and stripped bare. Tree branches lined the highway like black wire against the sky. It felt appropriate. Some truths become clearest only after every decorative layer has fallen away. My father was standing on the front porch when I arrived. That alone was unusual. My father did not wait on porches. He stayed in his chair and let others step into his space. The fact that he was outside, hands in his coat pockets, looking down the driveway when I killed the engine, told me more than any opening sentence could have. We went inside. My mother had coffee ready, a plate of pastries on the table. Everything looked normal in the way family homes always look normal right before difficult conversations. Ethan wasn't there. I assumed that was intentional. My father did not want this diffused by a witness, no one to joke, redirect, or reduce what needed to be said. We sat down at the kitchen table. My father spoke first. That surprised me. He said he didn't know how to begin, then stared into his coffee like the right sentence might be waiting there. Finally, he said, I was wrong. I didn't interrupt. I didn't rescue him. I had done too much rescuing in that family already. He said he hadn't understood what I did, said he had never really asked, said because I never complained, never came home in need of saving, never required anything visible, he had assumed I was fine. And once he had assumed that, he had let everything stay easy for himself. Then he looked at me, really looked, maybe for the first time in years, and said, I think I decided who you were too early. No, I said, you didn't think that. You did that. The kitchen went quiet. I spoke calmly, and that made every word heavier. I told him I had never needed him to understand every technical detail of my job. I didn't need him to know exactly how interagency response systems worked or how operations scaled under disaster conditions. What I had needed was much simpler. I needed him to look at me with the same basic respect he had always given Ethan, not more, equal. I needed a father who could hear that his daughter had done something meaningful without immediately shrinking it down to fit the smaller story he was comfortable telling. I needed to be his child in the same full way my brother had always been his child. My father's eyes filled quickly, faster than I would have believed possible from a man like him. I didn't soften instantly because of that. Tears that arrive years late do not automatically become redemption, but I also won't pretend seeing him like that didn't crack something small and stubborn inside me. He said he had never known how to be the kind of father I needed. Said he had been raised by a different kind of man, one who treated emotion as weakness. Then he stopped himself. Oro shook his head and said, "That's not an excuse. I'm not saying it to excuse anything." I nodded. "No, it isn't an excuse, but it is part of the truth." That may have been the first time in our lives that my father and I sat at the same table, without either of us trying to reduce the truth into something easier to survive. That afternoon, Ethan called. He said he had seen the news, said what I did in Savannah was extraordinary. Years earlier, I might have accepted that and moved on, but 12 days of thinking had taught me something. If the truth didn't get said fully this time, it would return later in its old shape. So I told him the compliment wasn't wrong, but it wasn't enough. I told him he had spent years benefiting from the way our father saw the two of us, and he had never stepped out of that comfortable position to correct the false story being told about me. I told him you do not have to be the villain to still do damage. Sometimes all it takes is standing silently in the light while someone else is being dimmed right beside you. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You're right." Some apologies do not fix anything immediately, but they still matter because at least they stop hiding. I did not tell him I forgave him. Forgiveness is not a switch. It does not flip because someone finally says the correct sentence. I only told him I had heard him and that hearing him say it mattered. Before I left that evening, my father walked me to the car. It was fully dark by then. Cold, still, November dark. The trees above us were bare, and he stood at the edge of the driveway with his hands in his coat pockets and said he was going to try to do better. I looked at him for a long moment and said, "I believe you'll try." Not, "I believe you will," but, "I believe you'll try." He heard the difference. He understood that effort could be real without instantly restoring trust. 4 months later, I stood at a formal appointment ceremony in Atlanta. Cold morning, sharp wind, not many people there, but the right ones. The people who knew exactly what it had cost me to stand where I was standing. Calvin was there, looking as unsurprised as a man can look when witnessing the thing he always knew was coming. My mother arrived 40 minutes early. My father came with her, wearing a navy overcoat I had never seen before, or the kind of coat people buy specifically because the occasion matters and they want to show up correctly. When the ceremony ended, my father hugged me, a long, awkward, wordless hug. No grand speech. But for the first time in my life, I didn't need one. He was saying enough with the fact that he stayed there and held on. I want to be honest about something before I finish, because stories like this are often turned into tidy little myths about family repair, as if one public moment of humiliation and one difficult kitchen conversation are enough to heal everything. Life does not work like that. My relationship with my family did not magically become whole because my name once appeared on national television. My father is trying. That part is real. He calls directly now. He asks more specific questions. He listens longer. Oh, but there are still silences between us that contain 15 years of distance. My mother is gentler in a different way now, but I can also see the late regret she has to live with. Ethan changed too, slowly, unevenly, the way real people change. We did not become a perfect family after Savannah, but none of that defines me anymore. Because the greatest victory was never that my father finally saw me on television. It wasn't the hug after the ceremony. It wasn't the silence in the diner when 21 people realized they had just watched a man misjudge his own daughter in public. The greatest victory is that before all of that, I had already begun to know who I was. I knew it in those dark morning runs at 16, when no one in my house was awake early enough to see what I was building. And I knew it when Calvin Reed named my strength correctly for the first time. I knew it standing in floodwater in Savannah while an 8-year-old boy searched my face for steadiness, and I was able to hand it to him. I knew it every single time I kept doing the work, even when nobody at home stood up and applauded. My father spent 15 years telling a smaller story about me, that I was just background, just paperwork, just logistics, just the daughter whose life sounded more important than it really was. But the truth is this: I did not become valuable the night Turner's family diner saw me on the news. That was only the night the lie ran out of room to breathe. It was only the night other people were forced to see a fuller version of what had been true for a long time. My value had already been built, quietly, in places no camera ever recorded, in the planning documents no one reads, in the midnight briefings, in the decisions no one remembers by name, because remembering them means the worst-case scenario was prevented. In every time I kept choosing the work because the work mattered, whether anyone praised it or not. If this story touched something in you, then maybe you understand why it was never really about television. It was about the part inside a person that knows its own worth, even while being seen incorrectly. It was about the fact that some people will only believe in you once the world confirms what they refuse to notice on their own. But their delay does not postpone your value. It was there already. It was real already. It was being built already each day by the way you lived and endured and kept going. Velena's story stayed with you. Hit like and subscribe right now. And if you've ever had to travel a long way just to learn how to believe in your own worth, leave a comment below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to read tonight. Thank you for staying to the end. And remember this, slowly and clearly. You do not need anyone's permission to know your value. Other people may take a very long time to see it, but the truth about who you are does not begin when they finally catch up. It was there long before that, and one day the world may be forced to look directly at it.